Sometimes a man reaches the end of his rope with nothing left but his faithful companion. Jack Morrison was such a man, carrying years of loneliness like dust on his coat. With his last $100, he bought what nobody wanted, a forgotten ghost town called Willow Creek. He hoped to find peace with his dog, Blue. The crumbling buildings seemed perfect for disappearing from the world. But when they explored the old schoolhouse, they discovered something that changed everything. A group of orphaned children had been secretly living there, surviving alone. Faced with walking away or staying to help, Jack found himself at a crossroads. What would you do if saving these forgotten children might save your soul? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Nevada desert as Jack Morrison's pickup truck rumbled down the dirt road toward what the county clerk had called a questionable investment at best. The engine wheezed with each mile, matching the rasp in Jack's chest that 3 decades of cigarettes had gifted. Him? In the passenger seat, Blue lifted his graying muzzle from his paws, amber eyes scanning the horizon with the patient wisdom that only comes from years of faithful companionship. Jack's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, against skin burned brown by countless days under the sun. At 62, he carried himself like a man who had learned that life's promises were often empty, but who still held onto a thread of hope too stubborn to break. The property deed crinkled in his shirt pocket with each bump in the road, a constant reminder of the leap he'd taken with his last $100. "Well, Blue," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 conversations with his only friend. "Reckon we're about to see what rock bottom looks like when you're already living in it." The border collie's tail thumped once against the worn fabric seat, a gesture Jack had learned to interpret as either encouragement or resignation. After 7 years together, since the day Blue had wandered onto his failing ranch, looking as lost as Jack felt, the distinction hardly mattered. The road curved around a cluster of Joshua trees, their twisted arms reaching toward the sky like desperate prayers, and there it was, Willow Creek, or what remained of it. Jack eased off the gas pedal, letting the truck coast to a stop at what might have once been the town's main street. The silence that followed the engine's death was profound, broken only by the whisper of desert wind through broken windows and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk. Buildings lined both sides of the dusty thoroughfare, their facades weathered to the color of old bones. The general store sagged on one side, its porch roof held up more by habit than structural integrity. A saloon stood with its bat-wing doors hanging at odd angles, like a mouth caught mid-sentence. The bank, ironically, appeared to be the most stable structure, its stone foundation defying the decay that had claimed its neighbors. Jack climbed out of the truck, his joints protesting with small pops and creaks that reminded him of his age. Blue bounded down after him, immediately beginning his ritual inspection of this new territory, nose to the ground, tail high with the enthusiasm that dogs maintain even in the face of human melancholy. The air tasted of dust and sage, with an undertone of something Jack couldn't quite place. Not decay exactly, but the absence of life. It was a town that had simply been forgotten, left to the mercy of time and weather, while the world moved on without it. He pulled the deed from his pocket, unfolding it carefully. The paper was already showing wear from his nervous handling during the 3-day drive from Wyoming. "Property known as Willow Creek Township," he read aloud, his voice carrying in the empty space. "Approximately 43 acres, including 17 structures and mineral rights to subsurface deposits." He folded the paper again, tucking it away. "Mineral rights," he snorted. "If there was anything valuable under this ground, it wouldn't have been for sale to the likes of me." The silver pocket watch in his vest caught the sunlight as he pulled it out, its face reflecting the sky above. 3:47. The time it had stopped running 15 years ago, the morning after his father's funeral. He'd never had it repaired. finding comfort in its eternal pause, as if time itself had acknowledged that some moments were too heavy to move beyond. He'd inherited the watch, along with the ranch, the debts, and the crushing responsibility of carrying on a legacy that had already begun to crumble. His father, Samuel Morrison, had been a man of the old school. Hard work, honest dealings, and the belief that character mattered more than profit. It was a philosophy that had worked well enough when cattle prices were steady and small ranchers could still make a living. But the world had changed. Corporate operations drove prices down, while costs climbed ever higher. Disease wiped out half his herd one winter. The bank called in loans with the casual cruelty of institutions that see numbers rather than lives. Jack had fought for 5 years to keep the place running, working dawn to dusk, selling off parcels of land piece by piece, like a man cutting away parts of himself to feed what remained. The end came not with drama, but with the quiet delivery of foreclosure papers on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other. Jack had sat at his kitchen table, Blue resting his chin on his master's knee, and read the words that made him homeless at 57 years old. The watch had seemed especially heavy that day, its stopped hands mocking the steady march of progress. That had left him behind. "Come on, boy," Jack said now, shouldering his duffel bag. Everything he owned fit in 2 bags and a cardboard box. "Let's see what we bought ourselves." They walked down what had been Main Street, their footsteps echoing off the empty buildings. Blue trotted ahead, investigating doorways and broken hitching posts with the thoroughness of a sheriff's deputy. Jack found himself studying the architecture, the way someone might examine old photographs for glimpses of vanished lives. The general store sign hung by a single chain, creaking softly in the breeze. Morrison's General Goods. Jack stopped, staring up at the weathered letters. Morrison, his father's name, his grandfather's name, his own name. It felt like a sign, though he'd learned to be skeptical of such easy symbolism. Inside, sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories made visible. Shelves stood empty but intact, their wood darkened, with age but still solid. Behind the counter, an old cash register sat with its drawer partway open, as if the last transaction had been interrupted by sudden departure. Jack ran his fingers along the counter's edge, feeling the wear patterns, left by countless hands. Someone had carved initials into the wood, EH plus MK, 1953. He wondered who they had been, whether they had found happiness, whether they had left Willow Creek by choice or necessity. The town wasn't large. He could walk from one end to the other in 5 minutes. Besides the general store and saloon, there was a blacksmith's shop with an anvil still sitting on its stump, a hotel with 8 rooms, a livery stable that smelled faintly of hay and leather, and at the end of the street, a small white schoolhouse with bell tower. It was the schoolhouse that drew him, perhaps because it seemed to have weathered the years better than the other buildings, or perhaps because schools represented hope in a way that commercial enterprises never could. The door was unlocked, its hinges protesting as he pushed it. Open. Inside, wooden desks sat in neat rows, facing a blackboard that still bore the faint traces of long-ago lessons. Children's drawings were tacked to one wall, their colors faded but still visible. Crayon houses with smoke curling from chimneys, stick-figure families holding hands, a rainbow stretching across a sky filled with birds. Blue had followed him inside and was now sniffing around the teacher's desk with interest. On the desktop, Jack found a grade book, its pages brittle with age. The last entry was dated June 15th, 1962. Miss Eleanor Hartford had taught 23 students that final year, their names written in careful script: Tommy Anderson, Sally Chen, Billy Morrison, Morrison again. Jack felt a strange chill, as if the empty town were trying to tell him something, weaving connections across time that he couldn't quite grasp. He closed the grade book, setting it back exactly where he'd found it. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Jack sat on the schoolhouse steps, Blue settling beside him with the contented sigh of a dog who had found his human's intended resting place. "Well, old friend," Jack said, scratching behind the dog's ears, "it's not much, but it's ours. First time I've been able to say that in 5 years." The silence stretched between them, comfortable and complete. No traffic, no neighbors arguing, no creditors calling, just the sound of wind through the empty buildings and the distant call of desert birds settling in for the night. Jack thought about the choices that had brought him here, each decision that had seemed reasonable at the time, each compromise that had carved away a little more of the life he'd thought he was building. The divorce that had divided his assets and his heart, the illness that had taken his mother, the years of fighting to save a ranch that had been doomed from the moment he'd inherited it. But here, in this forgotten place, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. Not hope exactly. He was too old and too scarred for that kind of optimism. But possibility. The chance to exist without explanation or apology. To find whatever peace was available to a man who had run out of everything except stubbornness and a faithful dog. The pocket watch ticked against his vest. No, that was impossible. It had been silent for 15 years, but there it was again, faint but unmistakable. Tick, tick, tick. He pulled it out, studying the face in the fading light. The hand still pointed to 3:47, motionless as always. Blue lifted his head. Ears pricked forward, staring at something Jack couldn't see. The dog's body tensed slightly, not with alarm, but with the focused attention of a creature sensing something significant. Then, as if satisfied, he settled back down, resting his chin on Jack's boot. "You hear something, boy?" Jack asked. But Blue's eyes were already drifting closed. As darkness settled over Willow Creek, Jack made his way back to the truck to retrieve his sleeping bag and camp stove. Tomorrow, he would begin the practical work of making this place livable. Tonight, he would sleep in his new home for the first time, surrounded by the ghosts of other people's abandoned dreams and the strange comfort of absolute solitude. The stars emerged one by one, brilliant in the unpolluted sky, and Jack Morrison closed his eyes, listening to the silence that had cost him everything he'd ever owned and everything he'd thought he'd wanted. 3 days into his new life, Jack had established a routine that felt like the beginning of peace. Wake before dawn, coffee over the camp stove, while Blue made his morning rounds, then methodical exploration of his domain. He'd started with the most practical buildings. The general store would make a decent living space once he cleared out the debris and patched the roof. The bank's vault could store his few valuables. The saloon might even provide entertainment once he figured out how to make the piano work again. It was Tuesday morning when everything changed. Jack was carrying a box of canned goods from his truck to the general store when Blue's behavior shifted. The dog had been trotting alongside him, content and relaxed, but suddenly he stopped mid-stride, ears erect, nose testing the wind. A low whine emerged from his throat, not alarm exactly, but something Jack had never heard before, puzzlement perhaps, or recognition. "What is it, boy?" Jack set down the box, following Blue's intense gaze toward the schoolhouse. The building looked the same as it had for the past 3 days. White clapboard siding weathered to pale grey, bell tower standing straight and proud, front door closed against the desert wind. Nothing had changed. Yet Blue was acting as if he'd discovered something remarkable. The dog took a few steps toward the schoolhouse, then looked back at Jack with an expression that clearly said, "You need to see this." Jack had learned to trust Blue's instincts. During their years together, the dog had warned him about rattlesnakes, approaching storms, and once a gas leak that could have killed them both. Whatever had caught Blue's attention deserved investigation. They approached the schoolhouse together, Jack's boots crunching on the gravel path while Blue padded silently ahead. The morning air was still cool, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something that made Jack pause. Smoke, not the acrid smell of a wildfire or the pleasant aroma of a campfire, but the thin, careful smoke of someone trying not to. be noticed. At the schoolhouse door, Blue sat and looked up at Jack with patient expectation. Jack reached for the doorknob, then hesitated. In 3 days of exploring, he'd been alone, except for Blue. The idea that someone else might be here, might be watching him, made his skin crawl with unease. But this was his property now. He had every right to enter every building on it. The door opened with its familiar creak, and Jack stepped into the classroom where sunlight still streamed through the windows onto those neat rows of desks. Everything appeared exactly as he'd left it, except for the smell. Not just smoke, but something else. Life. The indefinable mixture of scents that comes from human habitation. Blue walked directly to the teacher's desk and sat down, staring at Jack with an expression that seemed to say, "Well?" Jack moved deeper into the room, his eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance. The children's artwork still decorated the walls. The gradebook still sat on the desk. But there, on the floor behind the last row of desks, was a small dark stain. That hadn't been there before, and another one near the window. "Hello?" Jack called softly. "If someone's here, I'm not looking for trouble. This is my property, but I'm not unreasonable." Silence answered him, but it was a different quality of silence than he'd grown accustomed to. Not the empty silence of abandonment, but the held-breath silence of someone hiding. Blue walked to a door at the back of the classroom that Jack had assumed led to a storage closet. The dog sat in front of it and whined again, that same puzzled, urgent sound. Jack approached the door slowly, his heart beating faster than he cared to admit. At 62, he wasn't looking for confrontation, but he wasn't going to be intimidated in his own home either. The doorknob turned easily under his hand. The door opened onto a narrow staircase leading upward to the bell tower, Jack realized. Stairs he hadn't noticed during his first exploration. Light filtered down from above, and with it the unmistakable sounds of breathing, multiple patterns of breathing, trying to be quiet but unable to completely silence the basic function of life. "I'm coming up," Jack called, his voice gentler now. "Nobody's in trouble, I just want to talk." Each step up the narrow stairs creaked under his weight, announcing his approach. Blue followed close behind, his nails clicking softly on the wooden treads. At the top, Jack found himself in a small circular room dominated by the school bell that hung silent in its frame. But the bell wasn't what made him stop breathing. Arranged around the circumference of the room were 4 makeshift beds, old quilts spread over piles of straw with threadbare blankets folded at the foot of each. A small camping stove sat in the center of the space, its chimney pipe rigged to vent through a gap in the wall. Mason jars filled with water lined one wall. Canned goods were stacked neatly in a wooden crate that might once have held apples, and, pressed against the far wall, holding each other with the fierce protectiveness of survivors, were 4 children. The oldest couldn't have been more than 14, a girl with dark hair and eyes that had seen too much, standing with her arms spread wide to shield the 3 smaller ones behind her. A boy of perhaps 10, with sandy hair and defiant chin. Another girl, maybe 8, clutching a ragged cloth doll against her chest. And the smallest, a boy who couldn't have been older than 5, peering around the others with curiosity, fighting fear in his round face. Jack stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Children living here, in his ghost town, in his escape from the world. "Mister," the oldest girl said, her voice steady despite the tremor Jack could hear underneath. "We're not hurting anything. We keep the place clean. We'll move on if you want, but we don't have anywhere else to go." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. The resignation in her tone, the practiced way she held herself ready to protect the others, the careful cleanliness of their makeshift home. This wasn't a temporary hiding place. This was survival. "How long have you been here?" Jack managed to ask. "Since winter," she replied. "Maybe 4 months." 4 months. Through the cold desert nights, the spring windstorms, the beginning of summer's heat. 4 children, the oldest barely more than a child herself, surviving on their own in an abandoned town. "What are your names?" Jack asked, sinking slowly to his knees to bring himself to their eye level. The girl hesitated, then seemed to decide that courtesy cost nothing. "I'm Sarah. This is Tommy, Emma, and little Pete." She indicated each child in turn. "We're not criminals or nothing. We don't have people. Don't have people." The phrase lodged in Jack's chest like a splinter. He knew about not having people, about being alone in the world, about the particular kind of cold that comes from having nowhere to belong. But these were children, babies, some of them. Blue had climbed the stairs behind Jack and now approached the group slowly, his tail wagging low and gentle. Little Pete broke free from behind Sarah and knelt down to pet the dog, his face lighting up with the first genuine smile Jack had seen since entering the room. "He's friendly," Jack said automatically. "His name is Blue." "Blue," Pete repeated, burying his face in the dog's fur. "He's soft." Emma clutched her doll tighter, watching Jack with enormous eyes. Tommy maintained his defiant posture, but Jack could see the fear underneath. And Sarah watched him with the terrible wariness of someone who had learned that adults were not to be trusted. "Where did you come from?" Jack asked. "Foster. Home in Carson City," Sarah replied. We couldn't stay there anymore. We've been taking care of ourselves." The simple statement carried weights Jack couldn't even begin to calculate. Foster care failures, abuse, neglect, bureaucratic indifference. The 1,000 ways the system designed to protect children could fail them instead. He didn't need details to understand that these 4 had chosen the uncertainty of homelessness over whatever they'd left behind. "You've been doing a good job," Jack said, and meant it. The bell tower room was clean, organized, and surprisingly comfortable. Someone had thought about ventilation, water storage, and food preservation. Someone had created safety in a place the world had forgotten. "Who's been taking care of the planning, making sure you have food and water?" Sarah's chin lifted slightly. "I do the planning. Tommy helps with the heavy stuff. Emma keeps little Pete safe while we're gone. We all help. A family." They'd created a family from nothing, held together by necessity and love, and the simple determination to survive. Jack felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of assumptions he'd carried about his new life. "Well," he said finally, standing up slowly, "I suppose we should talk about what happens now." Sarah's arms tightened around the younger children, and Jack realized his words could sound like a threat. These children were preparing to run again, to abandon the only safe place they'd known in months, because an old man with a property deed had appeared to disrupt their carefully constructed world. The terrible irony wasn't lost on him. He'd come to Willow Creek to escape responsibility, to find peace in solitude. Instead, he discovered the one thing that could shatter his planned isolation completely: 4 children who needed someone to fight for them. Blue looked up at him from where Pete was still petting him, amber eyes patient and knowing, as if the dog had understood all along that their quiet retirement was never meant to be. Jack spent that first night after the discovery sleeping fitfully in the general store, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of a town that was no longer empty. Occasionally, he heard soft footsteps above, the children moving around in their bell tower sanctuary, probably discussing what his presence meant for their future. He'd told them they could stay the night, that they'd work something out in the morning. The relief on their faces had been almost unbearable to witness, especially Sarah's carefully controlled gratitude. She'd nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both appreciation and wariness. "Thank you, Mr. She'd begun. "Jack," he'd said, "just Jack." Now, as morning light filtered through the store's dusty windows, Jack wondered what exactly he'd committed himself to. He pulled out the faded photograph he'd carried in his wallet for 15 years. His ex-wife Karen, his daughter Lisa, and himself, taken at Lisa's high school graduation. They looked happy in the picture, unaware that within 2 years, cancer would take Lisa and grief would destroy his marriage. He'd failed at being a father when it mattered most. Lisa had been diagnosed during her sophomore year of college, and Jack had thrown himself into finding solutions, the best doctors, experimental treatments, anything that might save her. But he'd been so focused on fighting the disease that he'd missed simply being present for his daughter's fear, her need for comfort, rather than endless medical consultations. Karen had tried to bridge the gap between Jack's desperate optimism and Lisa's need for acceptance of her situation. When Lisa died, Karen blamed Jack for stealing precious time with their daughter by refusing to acknowledge the inevitable. Jack blamed Karen for giving up too easily. The blame became a poison that killed their marriage as surely as cancer had killed their child. Now, he was being asked to step into a parental role again, and the weight of his past failure pressed down on him like lead. Blue whined softly at the door, wanting his morning walk. Jack opened it to find little Pete sitting on the store's front steps, having somehow crept down from the bell tower without making a sound. "Morning," Pete said solemnly, as if greeting an old neighbor. "Morning yourself," Jack replied, settling beside the boy. "You're up early." "Sarah made pancakes on the camp stove. She sent me to ask if you want some." The simple offer of breakfast felt monumentally complex. Accepting meant acknowledging a relationship, a mutual dependence that Jack wasn't sure he was equipped for. Declining meant rejecting the children's first gesture of trust. "That's kind of her," Jack said. "I'd like that." Pete's face brightened. "She makes them real good. Sometimes we get syrup from the store in town when Tommy and her go for supplies." "You go into town?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Uh-huh. Sarah has some money. She saved from before. We're careful not to take too much at once, so nobody notices us." Pete's matter-of-fact description of their covert supply runs made Jack's chest tighten. A 14-year-old girl sneaking into town to buy groceries for her makeshift family, calculating how much they could purchase without drawing attention. 20 minutes later, Jack found himself climbing the narrow stairs to the bell tower, carrying a thermos of coffee and trying to ignore how domestic the gesture felt. The children had arranged themselves around their small camping stove, Sarah tending a frying pan while the others sat cross-legged on their quilts. "Hope you don't mind eating on the floor," Sarah said, not meeting his eyes. "We don't have a table up here." "Floor's fine by me," Jack said, accepting the plate she handed him. The pancakes were perfectly golden, light and fluffy, despite being made on a single-burner camp stove. "These are excellent." Emma beamed at the compliment, though she still clutched her doll and stayed close to Sarah. Tommy ate with methodical efficiency, his eyes constantly checking the windows, as if watching for threats. Only Pete seemed completely at ease, chattering about the various birds he'd observed from their perch in the bell tower. "We see everything from up here," he explained to Jack. "Hawks and ravens and sometimes eagles. Tommy saw a coyote family last week. 3 adults and 4 pups." Tommy added reluctantly, apparently unable to resist sharing the sighting despite his wariness of Jack. "Coyotes are smart," Jack observed. "Good parents, too. They take care of their own." Sarah's glance was sharp and searching, as if trying to determine whether his words carried hidden meaning. This girl, Jack realized, was constantly analyzing conversations for subtext, threats, opportunities. It was an exhausting way to live. After breakfast, Sarah began cleaning up with the others, helping in a routine that spoke of established roles and responsibilities. Jack watched them work, noting Emma's careful attention to detail, Tommy's protective positioning near the stairs, Pete's cheerful willingness to help with any task. "Sarah," Jack said, "could we talk, just you and me?" Her body tensed immediately. "The others stay with me." "Of course. I meant, could we step outside the room where we can speak privately but they can still see us?" After a moment's consideration, she nodded. They moved to the top of the stairs, where the younger children could observe them from the bell tower room, while Jack and Sarah could speak quietly. "You've done something remarkable here," Jack began, "taking care of 3 other children, keeping everyone safe and fed, creating a home in an abandoned building that takes real courage and intelligence." Sarah's expression remained guarded. They're not just other children. They're my family now. I can see that. And I can see how much they depend on you, how hard you've worked to protect them." Jack paused, choosing his words carefully. "But you shouldn't have to carry that responsibility alone. You're still a child yourself. I'm 14, and I'm not a child anymore." The words came out flat and final, a door closing on whatever innocence she might once have possessed. "Maybe not," Jack agreed, "but you're also not alone anymore. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." "Why?" The question came out sharp and suspicious. "Why would you want to help us? What do you get out of it?" Jack felt the weight of her distrust, earned through experiences he could only imagine. How? Many adults had let these children down. How many promises had been broken? How many times had help turned into harm? "Honestly, I don't know what I get out of it," he said. "I came here to be alone, to escape from the world. Finding you four wasn't part of my plan. Then why not just turn us in? Call the county, let them put us back in the system." The system. Sarah spoke the words like profanity, and Jack understood that whatever these children had experienced in foster care had been bad enough to make survival in an abandoned town seem preferable. "Because," Jack said slowly, "sometimes life gives you something you didn't know you needed. I lost my daughter 15 years ago, lost my family. I thought I was done with caring about anyone except Blue and myself." Sarah's expression softened, slightly, curiosity breaking through her defensive walls. "But seeing you four together, seeing what you've built here, it reminds me that family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to take care of each other." Jack met her eyes steadily. "You chose to become a family. Now I'm choosing to help you stay one. And if we say no, then I'll help you find somewhere safe to go. But I hope you won't say no. This town is big enough for all of us, and I think we might be able to help each other." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the intensity of someone trying to read the fine print on a contract that would determine her family's fate. "We'll try it," she said finally, "but if you change your mind, if you decide we're too much trouble, you have to give us warning. Time to figure out what comes next." "Fair enough," Jack said, and meant it. "But I won't change my mind." The first real test of their fragile arrangement came 3 days later, when Jack discovered Tommy was stealing from his supplies. It wasn't malicious. The boy had taken only a single can of beans and a pack of crackers, but the discovery hit Jack harder than the missing food warranted. He found Tommy behind the blacksmith shop, sharing the meal with a mangy desert cat that had wandered into town. "Figured you might be hungry," Tommy said to the cat, his voice carrying the kind of gentleness he'd never shown the humans around him. Jack watched from the shadows as Tommy broke the crackers into small pieces, placing them carefully where the cat could reach them without coming too close. The animal was clearly feral, probably surviving on rats and the occasional lizard, but Tommy's movements were patient and non-threatening. "He's been coming around for a week now," Sarah's voice came from behind Jack. She'd approached silently, a skill all the children seemed to possess. "Tommy's been saving part of his food for him every day." "With stolen food," Jack pointed out, not unkindly. Sarah's spine stiffened. "Tommy didn't steal anything, he borrowed it. We always pay our debts." "How?" "Watch." As Tommy finished feeding the cat, he pulled out a small pocket knife and began working on a piece of wood he'd pulled from his pocket. His hands moved with practiced precision, shaving thin curls that fell like snow onto the dusty ground. Within minutes, a recognizable shape began to emerge, a small bird, wings spread as if in flight. "He's been carving since he was 7, Sarah explained quietly. "His foster father taught him before—" She stopped abruptly. "Before what?" "Before things went bad." Sarah's tone made it clear the subject was closed. Tommy finished the carving and set it carefully on the ground near where the cat was eating. The wooden bird was remarkably detailed for something created with just a pocket knife, feathers suggested with careful cuts, the expression somehow managing to convey both freedom and longing. Jack stepped out of the shadows, and Tommy's hand immediately went to his knife, not threatening but protective. "That's beautiful work," Jack said, nodding toward the carving. Tommy's eyes narrowed. "Sarah told you about the food." "She did, but she also showed me something more important." Jack knelt down to examine the wooden bird more closely. "This is real craftsmanship. How long did it take you to learn to carve like this?" 3 years, maybe 4. Tommy's voice was cautious, waiting for the trap he was sure was coming. "I used to do some woodworking myself," Jack said. "Nothing this fine, mostly furniture repair and fence posts. But I had some tools, a set of carving chisels, some good hardwood blanks. Been sitting in my truck since I left Wyoming." Tommy's interest was immediate and quickly suppressed. So I was thinking, if you wanted to learn to use proper tools, we might work out a trade. You help me with some repairs around town. There's plenty of work that needs doing, and I'll teach you what I know about woodworking. Maybe we could even set up a proper workshop in the old stable." "What's the catch?" Tommy's question came, loaded with the suspicion of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment. "No catch. Just a man who needs help with manual labor and a boy who has talent that deserves proper tools to develop it." Tommy looked at Sarah, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "I guess that would be okay," he said carefully. "But I keep my knife. Wouldn't dream of asking you to give it up," Jack replied. "A man's tools are his own business." That afternoon, while Jack and Tommy worked on patching the general store's roof, Emma made her first tentative approach to Blue. She'd been watching the dog from a distance for days, clearly fascinated but too shy to get close. Blue, with the infinite patience that dogs seem to reserve for small children, lay perfectly still in the shade while Emma crept closer. She still carried her ragged doll everywhere, and Jack noticed she spoke to it constantly in whispered conversations that seemed to involve detailed explanations of everything happening around them. "She talks to Lily about everything," Pete explained, settling next to Jack to watch his sister's careful approach to the dog. "Lily used to belong to our real sister before." "Before what?" Jack asked gently. "Before the car accident. Emma was the only one who survived, and she was just 5 then. She's been carrying that doll ever since." Jack felt something cold settle in his stomach. Emma wasn't just shy, she was traumatized, carrying the weight of survivor's guilt that no 8-year-old should have to bear. The constant conversations with the doll suddenly made terrible sense. Does she remember them? Her family? Some. "Sarah says it's better if we don't ask her about it too much. Makes her have nightmares." Jack watched as Emma finally worked up the courage to touch Blue's fur. The dog's tail wagged slowly, and Emma's face lit up with the first genuine smile Jack had seen from her. "Lily, he likes us," she whispered to her doll. "He's not scared of us at all." That evening, Jack found Sarah washing clothes in a basin behind the schoolhouse, scrubbing each garment with methodical care. The children's clothes were clean but heavily mended, patches on patches that spoke of months of making do with limited resources. "I was thinking about taking a trip into town." "Tomorrow," Jack said. "Pick up some supplies, maybe some things the kids need." Sarah's hands stilled on the shirt she was washing. "We can pay our share." "That's not what I meant. It's what I meant." Sarah's tone carried the sharp edge of someone who'd learned that charity always came with strings attached. "We don't take handouts." What if it wasn't a handout? What if it was payment for work? Sarah turned to face him fully, water dripping from her hands. "What kind of work?" "This town needs a lot of fixing up if it's going to be livable." Tommy's already helping with repairs. Emma could help with cleaning and organizing. Pete's got sharp eyes. He could scout for materials we can salvage from the abandoned buildings. And you," Jack paused, choosing his words carefully, "you've been managing resources and keeping everyone organized for months. That's executive. Executive work," Sarah repeated, and for the first time, Jack heard something that might have been amusement in her voice. "Managing people, budgeting resources, long-term planning. Those are valuable skills. Worth fair wages." Sarah considered this, her practical nature warring with her distrust of adult promises. "What kind of wages?" "Enough to buy proper clothes, good food, maybe some books for Pete. He seems like the type who'd enjoy reading. Emma needs art supplies. I see how she looks at those faded drawings in the schoolhouse. And Tommy could use better wood and some carving tools of his own. And what do you get out of it? Jack looked around at the town that was already beginning to feel less empty, less like an ending and more like a beginning. I get to see what Willow Creek looks like when it's alive again. I get to stop feeling like my life ended when everything fell apart back in Wyoming. Sarah studied his face with that unnervingly mature assessment she'd perfected. You're serious about this? About all of us staying? I'm serious. Even if Emma has nightmares and wakes everyone up screaming. Even then. Even if Tommy gets angry and breaks things when he's scared. Even then. Even if Pete asks a million questions about everything and never stops talking. Even then. What about me? Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. What if I don't know how to let anyone else take care of things? What if I can't trust you not to leave? Jack felt the full weight of her fear then, not just of abandonment but of hope itself. This girl had been responsible for keeping 3 other children alive for months. The burden of that responsibility had become her identity, her armor against a world that had already proven it couldn't be trusted. Then we'll figure it out as we go, Jack said simply. All of us together. Sarah nodded slowly, and Jack saw her shoulders relaxed just slightly, as if she'd been carrying something heavy for so long she'd forgotten it was possible to set it down. Okay, she said, we'll try it your way. But I'm still doing the budget planning. I'm good at making money. Stretch. I'm counting on it, Jack replied, and meant it completely. 2 weeks into their arrangement, Jack woke to the sound of shouting. It was still dark outside, the desert air cold with pre-dawn chill, but angry voices carried clearly across the empty. A hound. Jack pulled on his boots and stepped outside to find Tommy and Sarah facing off in the middle of Main Street, their argument echoing off the silent buildings. Not a baby anymore, Sarah. Stop treating me like I can't think for myself. You start thinking like an adult instead of acting like a stupid kid, maybe I'll— Hey! Jack's voice cut through their conflict, not shouting but carrying enough authority to make both children turn toward him. What's the problem? She won't let me go to town with her, Tommy said, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Treats me like I'm Pete's age. Because you act like Pete's age, Sarah shot back. You see something shiny in a store window and forget we're supposed to be invisible. Last time you almost got us caught asking the store clerk about baseball scores. I was just being friendly. Friendly gets us noticed. Noticed gets us separated. Jack could see the fear behind Sarah's anger, the bone-deep terror of losing the family she'd fought so hard to keep together. But he could also see Tommy's frustration, the natural rebellion of a boy approaching adolescence who was being treated like a child by someone barely older than himself. Tommy, Jack said, why don't you help me get the morning fire started? Sarah, can we talk? Once Tommy had stomped off toward the general store, Jack turned to Sarah. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, shivering in the cold morning air but refusing to show weakness. You're afraid of losing him, Jack observed. I'm afraid of losing all of them. Do you know how many families get split up in the system? How many kids get separated from their siblings and never see each other again? Sarah's voice cracked slightly. We've been together for 8 months now. Through everything, I won't let them take that away. What if we made the trips to town together? You, me, and Tommy. That way you could teach him how to be careful without making him feel like you don't trust him. Sarah considered this, her practical mind weighing risks and benefits. You'd come with us? I need supplies anyway. Might as well make it a group effort. 3 hours later, Jack found himself driving his pickup truck toward the small desert town of Cedar Falls. Sarah in the passenger seat, maintaining a detailed list of necessities, while Tommy sat in the back, his excitement barely contained, despite his earlier anger. Emma and Pete had stayed behind with Blue, a compromise that had taken considerable negotiation. Emma because large groups of strangers still overwhelmed her, Pete because someone needed to watch over their makeshift home. Cedar Falls was the kind of town that existed purely out of stubbornness. 2,000 people clinging to life in the Cowboy desert because their grandparents had settled there, and moving seemed like admitting defeat. Main Street consisted of a grocery store, a hardware store, a gas station, and a diner that had seen better decades. "Remember," Sarah whispered to Tommy as they climbed out of the truck, "we're just visiting relatives. If anyone asks—" Tommy rolled his eyes but nodded. Jack noticed how naturally the children slipped into their roles, just quiet kids accompanying their grandfather on errands. It was a performance born of necessity and perfected through practice. In the grocery store, Jack watched Sarah work with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to stretch every dollar. She compared prices per ounce, chose generic brands, and mentally calculated totals as she filled the cart. Tommy helped by reaching items on high shelves and keeping track of the running total in his head. Apparently, he was good with numbers. When he chose to apply himself, it was at the hardware store that things got complicated. Jack was examining roofing materials while Sarah price-checked paint when Tommy disappeared. One moment he was studying a display of carving tools, the next he was gone. Sarah noticed first, her head snapping up with predatory alertness. "Where's Tommy?" Jack felt his stomach drop. Losing one of the children, even temporarily, felt like a betrayal of the trust Sarah had placed in him. They found him 3 doors down, standing in front of a small art gallery that shared space with a coffee shop. He was staring at a display of wooden sculptures, animals and birds, carved with a level of detail that made his own work look primitive by comparison. "They're incredible," Tommy said softly when Jack and Sarah approached. "Look at the way he got the texture of the feathers, how you can almost see them move." The artist's name was printed on a small placard. James Whitefeather, local craftsman. Several pieces had small red "sold" stickers. "People actually buy these?" Tommy asked, wonder in his voice. "Good art finds its audience," Jack said, studying. A carved eagle that seemed ready to take flight from its wooden perch. "Someone who can create beauty like this deserves to make a living from it." "Could I ever—" Tommy started, then stopped himself. "Could you ever what?" "Nothing. Forget it." But Sarah was looking at her foster brother with new understanding. "You want to learn to make things like this?" Tommy's face flushed. "It's stupid. I know it's stupid." "It's not stupid," Jack said firmly. "Wanting to create something beautiful, something that lasts, that's one of the most human impulses there is." Through the gallery window, they could see an elderly Native American man working at a bench in the back, his hands moving with practiced precision over a piece of wood. Tommy pressed his face to the glass, absorbing every detail of the man's technique. "Tell you what," Jack said, making a decision that surprised him. "Let's go introduce ourselves." James Whitefeather turned out to be a patient teacher and a perceptive judge of character. He examined the small bird Tommy had carved with his pocket knife, nodding approvingly at the clean lines and attention to detail. "You have good instincts," he told Tommy, "but you need proper tools and someone to show you technique. Raw talent only gets you so far." "We can't afford lessons," Sarah said quickly, her protective instincts flaring. "Who said anything about money?" James smiled. "I've been looking for someone to help me with the basic prep work, sanding, initial shaping, cleaning the workshop. It's not skilled labor, but it needs doing. Someone who wanted to learn could pick up a lot just by watching and listening." Tommy looked at Sarah with desperate hope, and Jack saw her internal struggle play out across her face. The desire to give Tommy this opportunity warred with her need to keep the family together and unnoticed. "What about school?" she asked finally. "What about it?" James replied. "I work afternoons and evenings mostly. Mornings would be free for whatever educational arrangements you have." Jack felt a plan forming, risky but potentially wonderful. "What? If Tommy came to work with you 3 afternoons a week, I could bring him and pick him up. Sarah could use the time to work on her own projects." "What projects?" Sarah asked suspiciously. "Well," Jack said, "I've been thinking about that old schoolhouse. Seems like a shame to let it sit empty when there are kids who could benefit from some structured learning. Someone who's good with organization and planning could set up a pretty decent homeschool program. Sarah's eyes widened as she grasped what he was suggesting. "You want me to teach them?" "I want you to have choices," Jack corrected. "All of you. Tommy can learn carving if he wants. Emma can have art supplies and space to heal. Pete can have books and someone to answer all his questions. And you can have the chance to use that sharp mind of yours for something besides just survival." The drive back to Willow Creek was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Tommy clutched a basic set of carving tools that James had given him as a starter kit. Sarah stared out the window at the desert landscape, her mind clearly racing with possibilities. As they pulled into town, Pete came running to meet them, Blue bounding alongside him. "Emma made soup," Pete announced proudly. "She remembered the recipe Sarah taught her, and she did it all by herself." Jack looked at Sarah, seeing the mixture of pride and fear in her expression. Her siblings were growing up, becoming more independent. For someone who'd defined herself as their protector, that growth felt like loss as much as progress. "She's ready for more responsibility," Jack said quietly as they unloaded supplies. "They all are." "I know," Sarah replied. "That's what scares me." That night, as the family gathered around their small camping stove in the bell tower, Jack listened to the easy chatter of siblings sharing their day. Emma described every step of making soup. Pete recounted the adventures he and Blue had experienced exploring the town. Tommy showed off his new tools and repeated everything James had taught him about wood grain and proper carving grip, and Sarah gradually began to smile. Not the careful, controlled expression she wore around strangers, but something genuine and unguarded. The smile of someone remembering what it felt like to hope for the future, instead of just surviving the present. Outside, the desert wind rang. The schoolhouse bell, a sound Jack had repaired that afternoon with Tommy's help, their first real project together. The bell's voice carried across the empty town, and for the first time since buying the place, Jack could imagine it filled with the sounds of life again. The nightmare came on a Thursday night, shattering the peaceful quiet that had settled over Willow Creek like a familiar blanket. Jack jerked awake to the sound of screaming, not the startled cry of someone waking from a bad dream, but the deep, primal wail of terror that seemed to tear the very air apart. He rolled out of his sleeping bag in the general store and ran toward the schoolhouse, Blue racing alongside him. In the bell tower, he found chaos. Emma sat bolt upright on her makeshift bed, eyes wide but unseeing, her small body rigid with fear as the screams poured out of her. Sarah knelt beside her, trying to provide comfort without making physical contact, some instinct warning her that touching might make things worse. Pete had pressed himself against the far wall, hands over his ears, tears streaming down his face. Tommy stood frozen in the middle of the room, his fists clenched, as if he wanted to fight whatever was terrorizing his sister, but didn't know how to battle memories. "She gets like this sometimes," Sarah said desperately as Jack climbed the stairs. "Ever since the accident. She'll come out of it, but—" Emma's screams cut off abruptly, replaced by broken sobbing. Her eyes focused gradually on the faces around her, reality seeping back in waves. "Lily," she whispered, reaching for her doll. "Where's Lily?" Sarah quickly placed the ragged cloth doll in Emma's arms. The girl clutched it against her chest, rocking slightly, as the tremors worked their way through her small body. "I dreamed about the car again," Emma said to the doll, her voice so quiet Jack had to strain to hear it. "I told them not to worry, that we were all safe now, but they kept screaming." Jack felt something break open in his chest. This 8-year-old girl was still trying to comfort the family members she'd lost, even in her dreams. The weight of survivor's guilt was crushing her, and she was facing it with the same fierce protectiveness Sarah showed for the living children. "Emma," Jack said gently, settling cross-legged on the floor at a respectful distance. "Do you think your family would want you to be scared all the time?" She considered this with the gravity children bring to important questions. "No. Mama always said fear was just love, with nowhere to go." "That's very wise. Your mama sounds like—" She was smart. She was. She knew about everything: how to make cookies shaped like stars, how to braid hair so it stayed neat all day, how to sing the worry birds away when bedtime felt scary. "Worry birds?" Emma nodded seriously. "The birds that fly around your head at night, whispering about all the bad things that might happen. Mama had a special song that made them fly away to bother someone else." Jack glanced at Sarah, seeing his own thought reflected in her eyes. Here was something concrete they could work with, not therapy or professional intervention, but a mother's love, translated into practical wisdom. "Do you remember the song?" he asked. Emma's face crumpled. "I tried and tried, but I can't remember. The words, and now the worry birds are getting stronger. What if we made a new song?" Sarah suggested suddenly. "Not to replace your mama's song, but to help until you remember the old one?" "Could we do that?" Emma asked, hope flickering in her dark eyes. "I think your mama would approve," Jack said. "After all, she taught you that love is the opposite of fear. We've got plenty of love in this room." The next morning, Jack made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He drove to Cedar Falls alone and returned with a bag full of art supplies: crayons, colored pencils, watercolors, and a stack of drawing paper. "I figured the general store could use some decoration," he explained to Emma, whose eyes had gone wide at the sight of so many colors. "Maybe you could help me figure out what kinds of pictures would make the place feel more like home." Emma's first drawing was tentative: a simple house with a chimney, smoke curling up into a blue sky. But as the days passed, her artwork became more complex and revealing. She drew the bell tower with remarkable accuracy, showing each window and the careful arrangement of their living space inside. She drew Blue chasing rabbits across the desert, his tongue lolling out in doggy joy. And then, a week after the nightmare, she drew a picture that made Jack's breath catch. 5 stick figures stood in front of the schoolhouse: a tall man with a grey beard, a girl with long dark hair, a boy holding something that might have been a carving knife, a smaller girl clutching a doll, and a little boy with an enormous smile. Beside them sat a dog with alert ears and a proudly wagging tail. At the bottom of the page, in careful first-grade handwriting, she had written, "My family." "This is beautiful," Jack told her, studying every detail. "Can I hang it up in the store?" Emma beamed with pride. "Lily helped me with the colors. She remembered what Blue's fur looked like in the sunshine." Meanwhile, Tommy was thriving under James Whitefeather's patient instruction. 3 afternoons a week, Jack drove him to Cedar Falls, where the boy absorbed woodworking techniques with the focused intensity of someone finding his calling. His pocket knife now shared space with proper carving tools, and his work showed dramatic improvement. More importantly, Tommy was learning to channel his anger into creation rather than destruction. Jack had witnessed the boys' temper during their first week together, explosive bursts of rage that seemed to come from nowhere and leave Tommy as shaken as everyone around him. But hours spent in concentrated carving had given him an outlet for the feelings he couldn't yet articulate. "Anger's just energy that doesn't know where to go," James had told Jack one afternoon while Tommy worked on an intricate carving of a desert hawk. "Give it direction, purpose, and it becomes power instead of poison." Sarah, meanwhile, had thrown herself into the project of creating a school in the abandoned classroom. She'd cleaned every surface, organized the old desks, and created lesson plans that would challenge each child at their appropriate level. Pete, it turned out, was reading at a 6th grade level, despite being only 5. Emma needed work on basic math, but had an intuitive understanding of colors and shapes that bordered on artistic genius. Tommy's intelligence was practical and hands-on. He struggled with abstract concepts but could solve complex spatial problems in minutes. "You're a natural teacher," Jack observed one afternoon, watching Sarah patiently work with Pete on multiplication tables while Emma practiced writing letters, and Tommy sketched designs for his next carving project. "I just know how they learn," Sarah replied. "I've been watching them figure things out for months." But Jack could see the cost of Sarah's selflessness in the careful way she held herself apart from the small joys the others were discovering. While Tommy found pride in his improving craftsmanship and Emma began sleeping through the night more often, Sarah remained vigilant, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "What are you afraid of?" Jack asked her one evening as they sat on the schoolhouse steps, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "Everything," Sarah said simply. "This is too good. We're too happy. In my experience, that's when things fall apart." Jack understood. He'd felt the same way during the brief periods of contentment in his own life, the persistent sense that happiness was borrowed time, that peace was just the calm before the next storm. "What if it doesn't fall apart this time?" he asked. "What if this is just what happens when people take care of each other?" Sarah looked at him with those two old eyes. "Do you really believe that?" Jack considered the question seriously. A month ago he would have said no, that loss and disappointment were the only constants in life. But watching Emma's nightmares give way to artwork, seeing Tommy's rage transform into careful craftsmanship, witnessing Pete's natural curiosity flourish in an environment where questions were welcomed rather than discouraged, it was changing his fundamental assumptions about what was possible. "I'm starting to," he said honestly. "These kids, all of you, you're teaching me that maybe I gave up too early on some things." That night, as Jack settled into his sleeping bag in the general store, he could hear the soft murmur of voices from the bell tower. Sarah telling the others a story, her voice calm and sure in the darkness. It was a sound he'd learned to treasure, the proof that his lonely ghost town had become something entirely different, a place where damaged people could heal, where abandoned dreams could take root again, where family could be chosen rather than just inherited. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain. And in the careful quiet of Willow Creek, 5 people and 1 faithful dog continued the patient work of building something that might last. The black sedan appeared on the horizon at exactly 11:30 on a Tuesday morning, its official lines cutting through the desert heat like a knife through silk. Jack spotted it first from where he was repairing the general store's front porch, and something cold settled in his stomach even before he could make out the government plates. "Sarah!" he called, his voice carrying more urgency than he intended. She appeared in the schoolhouse doorway immediately, her teacher persona falling away as she saw his expression. Her eyes followed his gaze to the approaching vehicle, and Jack watched her face go pale. "Get the others inside," she said quietly. "Now." But it was too late. The sedan pulled to a stop in front of the schoolhouse, dust settling around it like a curtain being drawn. 2 people emerged, a woman in a crisp business suit and a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The woman carried a briefcase, and the unmistakable authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. "Miss Chen." The woman's voice carried across the empty street with professional clarity. "Miss Sarah Chen, my name is Victoria Martinez, and I'm with Child Protective Services. We need to talk." Sarah's body went rigid. Behind her, Jack could see Tommy's face appear in one of the schoolhouse windows, then disappear quickly. Emma and Pete would be hiding wherever Sarah had taught them to go when strangers appeared, a protocol that suddenly made heartbreaking sense. "I don't know anyone by that name," Sarah replied, but her voice lacked conviction. Victoria Martinez consulted, a folder she'd pulled from her briefcase. "Sarah Chen, age 14, last seen 8 months ago when you disappeared from the Martinez foster home in Carson City with 3 other children. The FBI has been looking for you." The FBI. Jack felt the world tilt sideways. These children weren't just runaways from a bad foster situation. They were the subjects of a federal investigation. "I haven't done anything wrong," Sarah said, but she was backing toward the schoolhouse door. "No one said you have," Victoria replied, her tone surprisingly gentle. "But you did take 3 minor children across state lines without permission. That makes it federal kidnapping, regardless of your intentions." "Kidnapping?" Jack found his voice, stepping protectively closer to Sarah. "She's barely more than a child herself. She was trying to keep her family together." Victoria's companion spoke for the first time. "And you are?" "Jack Morrison. I own this property." "Mr. Morrison, I'm Agent Davis with the FBI. We're going to need to speak with you as well. Harboring fugitive minors is a serious federal offense." The words hit Jack like physical blows. Everything he'd built with these children, the trust, the healing, the fragile hope they'd all been nurturing, was about to be swept away by bureaucracy and legal definitions that had nothing to do with love or family. "Please," Sarah said, and for the first time since Jack had known her, she sounded like the 14-year-old girl she actually was. "Don't separate us. We're not hurting anyone here. We're happy." Victoria's expression softened slightly. "Sarah, I know you think you're protecting them, but these children need proper care. Medical attention, education, legal guardianship. They have all of that!" Sarah's voice rose with desperation. "Jack's been taking care of us. We have school, we have food, Emma's getting better. Emma Hartford needs professional counseling for her trauma." Agent Davis interrupted. "Tommy Brennan has anger management issues that require specialized intervention. And Peter—" "Stop!" Sarah's voice cut through his recitation like a blade. "Stop reducing them to case files and symptoms. They're my family. They're not your." "A family, Sarah, you know that." Jack saw something break in Sarah's eyes, the careful control she'd maintained for months, finally cracking under the weight of secrets she'd been carrying. "They are," she whispered. "They're all I have left." Victoria pulled out a chair from her briefcase and set it in the dust between them, a strangely civilized gesture in the middle of what felt like a standoff. "Sarah, why don't you tell Mr. Morrison the whole truth? About who you really are and how you ended up with these children?" Sarah looked at Jack with an expression of pure anguish. "I wanted to tell you. 100 times I almost told you." "Tell me what?" Sarah took a shuddering breath. "My name isn't Sarah Chen, it's Sarah Morrison, and this," she gestured at the town around them, "this used to be my grandfather's town." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. Morrison, the name on the general store sign. The name in the school records, the name that had seemed like coincidence. "Samuel Morrison was your grandfather?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was. And before you ask, yes, that makes us related. You're my great-uncle Jack. My dad was your nephew, David Morrison." Jack's legs gave out. He sat down, hard on the porch steps, his mind reeling. David. His brother Michael's son, who'd moved to California in the 80s. Jack had lost touch with that branch of the family years ago, too wrapped up in his own struggles to maintain connections. "David died in a car accident 3 years ago," Sarah continued, her voice steady now that the truth was finally coming out. "Mum died when I was little. I went into foster care, got bounced around between homes for 2 years. That's where I met them." She nodded toward the schoolhouse where the other children were hiding. "Tommy's parents died in a house fire when he was 8. Emma's family was killed in that car accident I told you about. She was the only survivor. Pete's mom was addicted to drugs, died of an overdose when he was 3. We all ended up in the same group home in Carson City." Agent Davis consulted his notes. "The Martinez foster home was shut down 6 months after you disappeared. The foster parents have been charged with abuse and neglect." Sarah's laugh was bitter. 6 months too. Late for us. By the time I took everyone and left, Tommy had a broken arm from falling downstairs. Emma had stopped talking completely, and Pete was so malnourished he looked like a skeleton. Jack felt sick. While he'd been wallowing in self-pity in Wyoming, his brother's granddaughter had been fighting to survive, protecting children who had no one else to fight for them. "So you brought them here?" Jack said. To Willow Creek. I remembered stories Grandpa Samuel used to tell me about this place. He said it had been in our family for generations, that it was somewhere you could disappear when the world got too hard to bear. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I thought maybe we could disappear here too. Victoria opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. Sarah, there's something else you need to know. Something we discovered during our investigation. She handed the envelope to Sarah, who opened it with trembling hands. Jack watched her face as she read the documents inside, saw confusion give, way to shock than to something that might have been hope. What is it? Jack asked. Sarah looked up at him with wonder in her eyes. Grandpa Samuel left a will, a real will, filed with the county 3 years ago, right before he died. He left Willow Creek to the Morrison family descendants, specifically to any Morrison who needed a place to start over. Victoria nodded. The property was never actually abandoned. It's been held in trust, waiting for a Morrison family member to claim it. When you brought the children here, Sarah, you weren't squatting on someone else's land. You were coming home. Jack felt the world shift around him again, but this time towards something that felt like destiny instead of disaster. So, when I bought the place with my last $100, you bought it from the trust, Agent Davis confirmed. The county clerk processed the sale because no Morrison had claimed it within the specified time frame. Legally, you own it, but morally, he looked at Sarah. It was meant to be a refuge for family. So what happens now? Sarah asked, her voice small and scared again. Victoria closed her briefcase and stood up. Now we figure out how to make this work legally. Mr. Morrison, are you willing to become a legal guardian for these children? Jack looked at the schoolhouse where 4 young faces were pressed against the windows, watching their fate being decided by adults in the street. He thought about the past 2 months, the laughter over breakfast, the pride in Tommy's improving craftsmanship, Emma's healing artwork, Pete's endless curiosity, and Sarah's fierce protective love. Yes, he said without hesitation, but only if that's what they want. The schoolhouse door burst open, and all 4 children poured out, Pete leading the charge. He threw himself at Jack with the complete trust that only small children possess, wrapping his arms around Jack's neck. You're really our family, Pete asked. For real this time. Jack looked at Sarah, his great niece who'd carried burdens no child should bear, who'd brought her chosen siblings to the one place in the world where they could all find refuge together. For real this time, he confirmed, and meant it with every fiber of his being. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains, Jack found himself signing papers that would make him the legal guardian of 4 extraordinary children. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd come to Willow Creek to escape family responsibilities, only to discover that family had been waiting for him all along. The black sedan disappeared back into the desert, carrying Victoria and Agent Davis back to their world of case files and bureaucracy. Behind them, they left something that looked remarkably like a miracle. 5 people and 1 faithful dog, all bearing the scars of loss and abandonment, choosing to build something better together in a town that had been waiting decades for the chance to be home to someone again. The first challenge came in the form of a phone call 3 days after Victoria Martinez left Willow Creek. Jack answered his cell phone while helping Tommy reinforce the stable roof, expecting to hear from the hardware store about a delivery. Instead, he found himself listening to a crisp, professional voice that made his blood run cold. Mr. Morrison, this is Harold Brennan, attorney at law. I represent the Brennan family regarding the custody of Thomas Michael Brennan. Jack climbed down from the ladder, motioning for Tommy to keep working while stepping out of earshot. What exactly does that mean? It means Tommy has grandparents in Phoenix who have just learned of his whereabouts. They're filing for custody and challenging your guardianship petition. We'll be requesting an emergency hearing within the week. The words hit Jack like hammer blows. He watched Tommy measuring boards with the careful precision James Whitefeather had taught him, saw the boy's face bright with concentration and purpose. 3 months ago, Tommy had been a broken child, lashing out at the world. Now he was learning to create instead of destroy, finding confidence in his growing skills. "Tommy's been with us for months," Jack said carefully. "He's thriving here, Mr. Morrison. My clients are Tommy's biological grandparents. They have a prior claim that supersedes any arrangement you've made with runaway children. The fact that you've been harboring these minors without proper legal authorization only strengthens their case." "And where were these grandparents when Tommy was being abused in foster care?" There was a pause. The Brennans were not aware of Tommy's situation until recently. They had been searching for him since his parents' death, but were told he'd been adopted by a family in Oregon. They only learned the truth when the FBI investigation made the news. After Harold Brennan hung up, Jack stood in the desert silence, feeling the weight of approaching battle. He'd been naive to think that legal guardianship would be simple, that love and good intentions would be enough to overcome the complex machinery of family law. The second blow came the next morning, delivered by a different lawyer representing a different set of grandparents. Emma's mother's parents in San Diego had seen the news coverage and were filing their own custody petition. They wanted their granddaughter returned to her proper family and away from the unstable situation in the desert. By the end of the week, Jack had received calls from 4 different law firms representing various relatives who had suddenly emerged from the woodwork, all claiming prior rights to the children they'd never bothered to search for while those children were struggling to survive. "They smell money," Sarah said bitterly as they sat around the kitchen table in the general store, the pile of legal papers growing between them like an accusation. "They think because we made the news, because we found a place to be happy, that somehow makes us valuable." Jack studied the documents with growing frustration. Custody hearings, emergency petitions, psychological evaluations, home inspections. The legal system was preparing to dissect their family with surgical precision, reducing love to measurable criteria and happiness to documented evidence. "What do we do?" Emma asked quietly. She'd been having nightmares again since the lawyers started calling, her artwork returning to dark themes of separation and loss. "We fight," Jack said simply. "We document everything we can about how well you're all doing here. We get character. Witnesses, medical records, educational progress reports. We show them that what we have isn't just legal, it's right." But privately, Jack felt the familiar weight of helplessness settling over him. He'd fought bureaucracy before when he lost his ranch, fought insurance companies when Lisa got sick, fought the inexorable machinery of institutions that reduce human lives to spreadsheet entries. He'd lost those battles, and he was terrified of losing this one too. The home inspection came first, conducted by a social worker named Mrs. Patterson, who arrived with a clipboard and the demeanor of someone prepared to find fault. Jack watched her examine their living arrangements, the children's carefully organized bell tower room, the makeshift classroom in the schoolhouse, the general store that served as his bedroom, and their common area. "The children are sleeping in an unheated bell tower," she noted, writing on her clipboard. "The bell tower is well insulated and comfortable," Sarah interjected. "We've been living there safely for months." "And who supervises their education?" "I do," Sarah said proudly. "I've developed individualized lesson plans for each of them. Pete is reading above grade level now. Emma's artistic abilities are developing rapidly, and Tommy's learning practical skills along with traditional subjects." Mrs. Patterson made more notes. "What about professional counseling for Emma's trauma, medical care, proper nutrition monitoring?" Jack answered those questions, explaining Emma's improving sleep patterns and artwork, the regular checkups he'd arranged in Cedar Falls, the balanced meals they shared as a family. But he could see Mrs. Patterson's skepticism, the way she measured their unconventional family against some invisible standard of normalcy. After she left, the children gathered in the kitchen, their faces tight with worry. "She didn't like us," Pete said. His usual cheerfulness dimmed. "She kept writing bad things down." "She was just doing her job," Jack said, but he didn't believe it himself. Mrs. Patterson had seemed determined to find problems rather than solutions, to see deficits rather than progress. The custody hearings were scheduled for the following month, all 4 cases to be heard by Judge Elizabeth Hawthorne in the family court in Carson City. Jack spent sleepless nights preparing his arguments, gathering evidence of the children's progress, trying to build a legal case around something as intangible as love. Tommy's transformation was the most dramatic. James Whitefeather provided a written statement about the boy's artistic development and emotional growth, along with photographs of Tommy's increasingly sophisticated carvings. Dr. Reynolds in Cedar Falls documented the disappearance of the explosive anger episodes that had marked Tommy's early months in foster care. Emma's healing was evident in her artwork progression, from dark, traumatic images to bright drawings of family gatherings and desert wildlife. Her teacher's assessment showed remarkable improvement in both academic skills and social interaction. Pete's natural curiosity had flourished in their homeschool environment. He could now read chapter books, solve complex math problems, and had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of desert ecology from his daily explorations with Blue. But it was Sarah's sacrifice that worried Jack most. At 14, she should have been focusing on her own education and development. Instead, she'd spent 2 years protecting and nurturing 3 other children, taking on adult responsibilities that had shaped her into someone older than her years. The court's going to ask why you ran away instead of working within the system, Jack warned her as they prepared for the hearings. They'll want to know why you didn't trust the authorities to help you. Sarah's laugh was harsh. Because the authorities put us in a home where Tommy got his arm broken and Emma stopped talking. Because the system that was supposed to protect us treated us like problems to be managed instead of people to be cared for. That's what you need to tell the judge. All of it. Let her see what you were running from and what you were running toward. The night before the first custody hearing, Jack found Sarah sitting alone on the schoolhouse steps, staring out at the desert under a canopy of stars. The weight of impending separation hung heavy between them. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice small in the vast silence. What if they split us up? What if Emma goes to grandparents who don't understand her nightmares? What if Tommy ends up with people who think his carving is a waste of time? Jack settled beside her, feeling the warmth radiating from the wooden steps that had absorbed the day's desert sun. Then we'll find a way to fight for them, all of them, for as long as it takes. You'd do that, even if the court says you're not legally responsible for us anymore? Jack thought about the question. Seriously, 3 months ago he'd been a broken man looking for solitude and peace. These children had given him something far more valuable: purpose, hope, and the second chance at fatherhood he'd never expected to receive. Sarah, family isn't about legal documents or blood relations or who has the best lawyer. It's about choosing to show up for each other day after day through whatever comes. You taught me that when you chose to protect these kids instead of just protecting yourself. Sarah leaned against his shoulder, and Jack felt the full weight of trust she was placing in him. Tomorrow, they would walk into a courtroom and fight for the right to remain together. They would face lawyers and relatives and a system that measured love in documentation and happiness in compliance with regulations. But tonight, they were still a family. The children were asleep in their bell tower sanctuary, safe and loved and unaware that adults were preparing to decide their fate with legal arguments and bureaucratic procedures. Blue emerged from the shadows and settled at their feet, his presence a reminder that loyalty couldn't be legislated and devotion couldn't be mandated. Love, Jack had learned, was always a choice. And tomorrow he would have to convince a judge that sometimes the most important choices were made by the heart rather than the head. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the desert answered, with the ancient song of creatures who understood that family was worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. The Carson City Family Court building rose from the Nevada desert like a monument to bureaucratic authority, its glass and steel facade reflecting the morning sun with cold precision. Jack adjusted his tie, the only one he owned, purchased specifically for this day, and tried to steady his breathing as they approached the courthouse steps. Sarah walked beside him in a borrowed dress that made her look younger and older simultaneously. Younger, because it reminded everyone that she was still just 14. Older because of the weight of responsibility she carried in her careful posture and measured steps. Tommy, Emma, and Pete followed behind, scrubbed clean and dressed in their best clothes, holding hands in a chain of solidarity that had become their trademark during these difficult weeks. The first hearing was Tommy's case, and the courtroom filled quickly with people who had suddenly appeared to claim a stake in his future. His grandparents, Robert and Martha Brennan, sat in the front row with their attorney, projecting the kind of respectable middle-class authority that commanded judicial attention. They were well-dressed, well-spoken, and utterly unfamiliar with the boy they were fighting to claim. Judge Elizabeth Hawthorne entered with the measured dignity of someone who had spent decades making decisions about other people's lives. She was younger than Jack had expected, perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to weigh every gesture for its deeper meaning. "This court is called to order for the custody hearing regarding Thomas Michael Brennan," she announced, her voice carrying easily through the silent courtroom. Harold Brennan, the attorney for Tommy's grandparents, stood to present his opening argument. He painted a picture of loving grandparents who had been searching desperately for their grandson, only to discover he was living in an abandoned desert town with a man who had no legal authority to care for him. "Your Honor, the Brennans represent stability, appropriate educational opportunities, and connection to Tommy's biological family. They can provide the structured environment and professional resources this troubled young man needs to overcome his behavioral issues." Jack felt his jaw clench at the casual dismissal of Tommy's progress, the reduction of a complex, talented boy to behavioral issues that needed to be managed rather than understood. When it came time for Jack's attorney, a young public defender named Maria Santos, who had volunteered to take their case, to present their argument, she called Tommy to the stand. The boy walked to the witness chair with the careful composure he'd learned from months of survival, but Jack could see the tension in his shoulders. Tommy had never spoken publicly about his experiences before, had never been asked to justify his choice of family to strangers who would decide his fate. "Tommy," Maria said gently, "can you tell the court about your life before you came to Willow Creek?" Tommy's voice was quiet but clear. "It was bad. The foster home was bad. Mr. Martinez hit us when we made mistakes, and Mrs. Martinez didn't care if we were hungry or scared. My arm got broken when Mr. Martinez pushed me down the stairs." "For talking back. And what changed when you came to live with Mr. Morrison?" Tommy straightened in the witness chair, some of the fear leaving his expression. "Everything. Jack, Mr. Morrison, he doesn't hit. He listens when I get angry instead of punishing me for it. He got me proper carving tools and introduced me to James, who's teaching me to make real art." Tommy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden eagle, its wings spread wide, every feather carefully detailed. "I made this for him. It took me 3 weeks to get it right." Jack felt tears prick at his eyes as Tommy held up the carving. It was beautiful work, far beyond anything the angry, destructive boy of 3 months ago could have created. Harold Brennan stood for cross-examination. "Tommy, do you understand that your grandparents love you and want to give you a proper home with other children your age, good schools, and professional counseling?" "I understand that they never came looking for me when I needed them," Tommy replied, his voice steady. "I understand that they want me now because they saw us on the news, not because they cared about me when I was getting hurt." "Tommy, wouldn't you like to have your own room, your own things, instead of living in an abandoned building in the desert?" Tommy looked across the courtroom at Jack, Sarah, Emma, and Pete, his eyes fierce with the kind of loyalty that couldn't be bought or mandated. "I already have my own things. I have my family. I have people who know that when I carve wood, I'm not just playing around, I'm making something that matters. I have Jack, who fixed my broken trust the same way he fixed the buildings in our town. Piece by piece, until it was strong again. The courtroom fell silent, except for the scratch of the court reporter's fingers flying across her keyboard. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward slightly, studying Tommy with increased attention. "And if this court were to place you with your grandparents?" she asked directly. Tommy's answer came without hesitation. "Then I'd probably run away again. Not because I want to hurt anybody, but because I learned the difference between being somebody's responsibility and being somebody's family. Jack chose to be our family. These people," he nodded toward his grandparents, "they just want to fix their mistake." Harold Brennan objected, but Judge Hawthorne held up a hand for silence. "Tommy, you may step down," as the boy walked back. To their table, Jack saw something in the judge's expression that might have been understanding. But they still had 3 more cases to fight, 3 more children whose futures hung in the balance of legal arguments and competing claims of love. The real battle was just beginning. The afternoon session brought Emma's case, and Jack watched. His youngest charge approached the witness stand with her doll clutched tightly in her arms. Her grandmother from San Diego, Patricia Hartford, sat rigidly in the gallery, disapproval radiating from her perfectly composed figure like heat from asphalt. Judge Hawthorne had requested to speak with Emma privately, recognizing that an 8-year-old trauma survivor needed special consideration. The courtroom was cleared except for the attorneys and court personnel, but Jack could see Emma through the glass partition, her small voice carrying the weight of experiences no child should have to bear. When the session resumed, Judge Hawthorne's expression was thoughtful and troubled. She called Patricia Hartford to the stand first. "Mrs. Hartford, you've stated that you want custody of your granddaughter Emma. Can you tell the court about your relationship with her prior to your daughter's death?" Patricia Hartford adjusted her purse strap and lifted her chin. "We had limited contact. My daughter made certain choices that my husband and I couldn't support. We lost touch when Emma was very young." "What choices were those?" "Sarah, my daughter, married a man of questionable character. They lived an unstable lifestyle, moving frequently, always struggling financially. We offered help, but they were too proud to accept it." Jack felt Sarah tense beside him. Even in death, Emma's mother was being judged by standards that prioritized appearances over love. "Mrs. Hartford, are you aware that Emma suffers from severe trauma related to the car accident that killed her family?" "Of course. That's exactly why she needs professional treatment, not amateur therapy from strangers in the desert." Judge Hawthorne made a note. "What is your understanding of Emma's current condition and progress?" "I understand she's been living in primitive conditions with people who have no training in child psychology. She clearly needs proper medical intervention." When it was Maria Santos's turn to present their case, she called Dr. Reynolds, the physician who had been monitoring the children's health. "Dr. Reynolds, what has been your assessment of Emma's progress over the past 2 months?" "Remarkable improvement," the doctor said firmly. "When I first examined Emma, she was withdrawn, barely spoke above a whisper, and showed signs of chronic anxiety. Her most recent visit showed dramatic positive changes. She's gained weight, her nightmares have decreased significantly, and she's begun engaging socially again." "What do you attribute this improvement to?" "Stability, patience, and unconditional love. Emma is thriving in an environment where her trauma is acknowledged but doesn't define her, where she's encouraged to heal at her own pace rather than according to clinical timetables." Finally, Maria asked Emma herself to speak. The little girl approached the witness stand carrying a drawing she'd made while waiting in the hallway. 5 stick figures and a dog standing under a bright rainbow with careful words printed at the bottom, "Please don't break us." "Emma," Judge Hawthorne said gently, "can you tell me about this picture?" Emma's voice was soft but clear. "That's our family. Jack and Sarah and Tommy and Pete and me and Blue. We take care of each other. What would you like to tell me about living with your family in Willow Creek. I don't have bad dreams as much anymore. Sarah teaches me numbers, and Jack lets me paint pictures for the store. Tommy makes me animals out of wood, and Pete reads me stories. When I'm scared, they all help me remember that I'm safe. Patricia Hartford's attorney cross-examined Emma with uncomfortable persistence about her grandmother's ability to provide. Better opportunities, better schools, better medical care. But Emma's answers remained consistent and heartbreaking in their simplicity. I don't want better things, she said finally. I just want my family. The final testimony came from an unexpected source. Judge Hawthorne called Jack to the stand, not as a witness in his own defense, but as the central figure around whom all these lives had reorganized themselves. Mr. Morrison, 3 months ago, you were a man seeking solitude. Today, you're fighting to become the legal guardian of 4 traumatized children. What changed? Jack looked across the courtroom at the children who had transformed his life so completely he barely recognized himself anymore. Sarah, who had taught him that love was a choice made daily through small acts of protection and care. Tommy, who had shown him that anger could be transformed into creation with patience and proper tools. Emma, who had reminded him that healing happened in its own time and couldn't be rushed. Pete, who had brought joy back into his life simply by believing that questions always deserved answers. Your Honor, I thought I was done with family. I thought I'd failed at it so completely that I didn't deserve another chance. These children taught me that failure isn't about falling down. It's about refusing to get back up and try again. Jack's voice grew stronger as he continued. Sarah didn't just save 3 other children when she brought them to Willow Creek. She saved me too. She reminded me that family isn't about being perfect, it's about being present. Are you prepared for the challenges of raising 4 children with complex needs? No, Jack said honestly, but I'm prepared to learn, to make mistakes, to ask for help when I need it. These children have already survived the worst things life could throw at them. What they need now isn't perfection. It's commitment. Judge Hawthorne recessed the court for deliberation. The waiting felt eternal, each minute stretching like hours, as relatives and attorneys murmured in the hallway and the children sat in tense silence. When court reconvened, Judge Hawthorne looked directly at the family clustered around Jack before she spoke. In the matter of custody for Thomas Brennan, Emma Hartford, and Peter Chen, this court finds that the best interests of these children are served by maintaining their current placement with Jackson Morrison, subject to regular monitoring and support services. The words hit Jack like a physical blow of relief. He felt Sarah's hand slip into his, felt the children press closer together, felt the weight of months of uncertainty finally lift from his shoulders. These children have created something extraordinary, Judge Hawthorne continued. They have built a family from love, necessity, and mutual protection. This court will not destroy what love has built simply to satisfy conventional expectations of what a family should look like. As they walked out of the courthouse into the Nevada sunlight, Jack felt the full weight of what they had accomplished. They had faced the system that had failed these children before and convinced it to trust in love over regulation, commitment over convention. They were going home together. 6 months after the custody hearings, Jack stood in the doorway of what had once been the Willow Creek General Store and marveled at how completely his life had changed. The building buzzed with the kind of comfortable chaos that only comes from a house full of children living fully realized lives. Emma sat at the kitchen table, watercolors spread before her as she worked on a commission. Yes, a commission for the new doctor's office in Cedar Falls. Her artwork had evolved from trauma processing to genuine artistic expression, and word had spread about the little girl who could capture the desert's beauty in ways that made grown adults stop and stare. "Jack, look," she called, holding up her latest painting. "Dr. Martinez said I should paint what makes me happy, so I painted all of us having breakfast together. See? There's blue under the table, and Pete's asking one of his million questions." and Tommy's showing Sarah his new carving. The painting was remarkable, not just for the technical skill Emma had developed, but for the pure joy radiating from every brushstroke. This was a child who had found her way back to happiness after surviving horrors that would have broken many adults. Tommy emerged from the workshop he and Jack had built in the old stable, carrying a finished sculpture that took Jack's breath away. The piece, a family of hawks soaring together, would be displayed in James Whitefeather's gallery next week. At 15, Tommy had developed a reputation throughout the region for his intricate wildlife carvings. More importantly, he'd learned to channel his intensity into creation rather than destruction. "The gallery owner from Reno wants to set up a meeting," Tommy announced, trying to sound casual but unable to hide his excitement. "James thinks I'm ready to start selling to collectors." Sarah looked up from where she was grading Pete's math. Work. Their homeschool had evolved into something that challenged each child at their own level, while maintaining the flexibility that traditional schools couldn't offer. At 15, Sarah had officially become Jack's co-parent, a partnership that worked because they'd both learned to balance authority with respect. "College representatives will want to see your portfolio when you're ready," she told Tommy. "James says some art schools offer full scholarships for exceptional talent." Pete, now 6 and reading at an 8th grade level, was absorbed in a book about desert ecology while simultaneously building an elaborate fort out of wooden blocks. His natural curiosity had found perfect soil in Willow Creek, where every question led to exploration and every exploration led to learning. "Jack," Pete said without looking up from his book, "did you know that kit foxes can hear a mouse moving underground from 20 feet away?" "I did not know that," Jack replied, settling into his chair with the kind of bone-deep contentment he'd never expected to experience again. "What else did you learn today?" As Pete launched into a detailed explanation of desert predator-prey relationships, Jack felt the familiar weight of his father's pocket watch in his vest. He pulled it out and was no longer surprised to see the hands moving steadily around the face. 3:48, 3:49, 3:50. The watch had started running again the day they'd returned from the courthouse, as if time itself had decided their family was worth marking. The evening routine had become a cherished ritual. After dinner, they gathered in the main room of the general store, which no longer felt like a store, but like the heart of a real home. Tommy would work on his latest carving while Sarah helped, Emma with reading. Pete would curl up with Blue and a book, and Jack would simply watch, amazed by the miracle of ordinary domestic happiness. Tonight was different, though. Tonight marked exactly 1 year since Jack had first discovered the children in the bell tower, and Sarah had surprised everyone by suggesting they have a family meeting. "I want to talk about something," she began, her voice carrying the authority she'd earned through months of proving her wisdom. "Jack, do you remember what you told Emma about her family not wanting her to be scared all the time?" Jack nodded, wondering where this was leading. "Well, I think the same thing applies to all of us. We've spent so long surviving, so long being, afraid of what might happen, that sometimes I forget we're allowed to dream about what we want to happen." She looked around at her chosen siblings, her eyes bright with possibility. "I want to go to college and study education. I want to learn how to teach kids like us, kids who need something different than what regular schools can give them." Tommy spoke up next. "I want to keep learning from James, but I also want to travel someday, see how other artists work, learn techniques from different cultures. I want to be a scientist," Pete announced solemnly. "I want to study animals and write books about them so other people can learn about desert creatures." Emma held up her paintbrush. "I want to paint pictures that make sad people feel happy again, like Jack did for us, but with colors instead of words." They all turned to look at Jack, waiting for him to share his dreams for the future. Jack thought about the man who had driven into Willow Creek a year ago, broken, alone, convinced that his life was over at 62. That man had been seeking an ending. Instead, he'd found the most important beginning of his life. "I want to see all of your dreams come true," he said simply. "I want to be the person you can always come home to, no matter how far you travel or what you accomplish. I want Willow Creek to be the place where you learned that family isn't about who you're born to. It's about who chooses to love you and stick around long enough to prove it." Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of rain. The town sign Tommy had carved and installed last month creaked gently on its post. Willow Creek, population 5 plus 1, dog, a place where families choose each other. As the stars emerged one by one in the vast Nevada sky, Jack Morrison sat surrounded by the children who had saved him as much as he'd saved them, listening to their laughter and plans and dreams, knowing that sometimes the best families are the ones you never saw coming. In Willow Creek, the ghost town that had learned to live again, 5 people and 1 faithful dog continued the patient work of proving that love, when given room to grow, could transform the most unlikely places into home.